$230 million, Lucia repeated slowly, studying the American passport in her hands. The sick young man she had saved from the rain wasn't who he appeared to be. Before we discover how a millionaire heir ended up begging for shelter in a small Spanish town, tell us in the comments, have you ever witnessed or performed an act of kindness with a stranger? Share your story and tell us where you're from. 3 months earlier, Dylan Mitchell was carrying more than an 18-pound backpack through the cobblestone streets of Milady. He carried the weight of a betrayal that had destroyed everything he believed in. He had discovered that the woman he loved was in the arms of his childhood best friend, the man he had known since he was 8 years old and trusted most in the world. Now, after 33 days of walking through physical pain, hoping to heal the pain of his soul, he was just 3 days from Santiago de Compostela. But fate had other plans. The cutting wind carried the scent of wet eucalyptus and the promise of more rain when Dylan stopped in the middle of the uneven cobblestone street, feeling every muscle in his body screaming in pain. His hands, once manicured weekly at Manhattan's most expensive salons, now displayed thick calluses and thorn scars. The American passport in his back pocket weighed like an unmade confession, while his empty stomach growled loud enough to embarrass him. 33 days, 435 miles since Saint-Jean-Pied-de-Port, France. Each step a deliberate escape from the skyscrapers his family owned, from board meetings where his Mitchell surname opened doors he no longer wanted to walk through. The Camino de Santiago had promised answers. So far, it had only delivered foot blisters and the growing weight of a loneliness that all the money in the world couldn't buy. The first drops of afternoon rain began to drum against the already saturated fabric of his pilgrim jacket, each drop heavy as a cold silver coin against his feverish skin. Dylan pulled his hood over his blonde hair that now touched his shoulders, a silent rebellion against the military cuts his father had always demanded. His blue eyes, clouded by exhaustion and what might be the beginning of the flu, swept the stone facades of the small Galician town, searching for any sign of shelter for the approaching night. It was here, in the middle of nowhere Spain, that his journey of self-discovery was about to take a turn that not even his millions in family wealth could have predicted. 2 hours earlier, Dylan had been at the local cafe, savoring a cortado that cost less than a tip at any establishment in his New York social circle. His 18-pound backpack rested beside the worn wooden chair, containing everything he owned in the world for the past 33 days. 2 changes of clothes, an ultra-compact sleeping bag, his documents, and the last 200 euros he had set aside for emergencies. When he returned from the bathroom, the backpack was gone. The panic that seized him wasn't familiar. In Manhattan, problems were solved with a phone call, a credit card, a bank transfer. Here, looking at the empty space where his backpack should have been, Dylan experienced for the first time in his life the real vulnerability of need. The cafe owner, a portly man with a graying mustache, helped him search the nearby corners and alleys. They found the backpack 40 minutes later, thrown behind a dumpster with clothes scattered, like carcasses of a devoured animal. The documents were there, stained but readable, the sleeping bag torn but usable, the 200 euros gone. Lo siento mucho, hijo, the man murmured, his rough hands touching Dylan's shoulder with a gentleness that made the young man's eyes burn. Voy a llamar a la Guardia Civil. No, Dylan shook his head, his voice coming out hoarser than usual. No need. I'll figure it out. But there was no figuring it out. The thief hadn't just taken Dylan's 200 euros, he had taken the last layer of his armor. For the first time in his life, Alexander Dylan Mitchell, heir to an empire, was completely helpless. And that was exactly what he had come looking for. What he didn't expect was that the real test was still to come. All the hostels were full. The cheapest guest house cost 35 euros a night, and Dylan had exactly 3 euros and 50 cents in his pocket. The change from the cortado that now seemed to have been his last decent meal in a long time. That's when it started to rain. Not the fine, persistent drizzle that had accompanied most of his journey through the Pyrenees, but a torrential rain that turned the cobblestone streets into treacherous streams. Dylan tried to find shelter under the awning of an already closed bakery, but the wind pushed the water sideways, soaking his clothes in minutes. When he stumbled on a crack between the irregular stones, Dylan lost his balance completely. His fall was heavy and uncontrolled against the wet stones. The impact was brutal. His head hit hard against the uneven pavement, and immediately his vision darkened. Dylan collapsed unconscious on the stones, losing consciousness for several minutes. When he came to, he was still in the torrential rain, his body shaking violently, and a throbbing pain in his right ankle. As he tried to get up, dizzy and disoriented, a female voice, young and concerned, cut through the noise of the rain. "Estás bien? ¿Necesitas ayuda?" Dylan looked up and saw a young woman of maybe 19, dark brown hair dripping rainwater, honey-colored eyes full of a sincere concern he no longer recognized in the world he came from. She held a small umbrella over her head, but even so, she was almost as wet as he was. There was something in her expression, a real urgency at seeing someone clearly hurt and disoriented. "I don't speak much Spanish," Dylan murmured in English, his voice trembling as much as his body, still feeling dizzy from the fainting. "Ah, you're a pilgrim," she replied in the same language, with a musical Spanish accent that warmed something inside his chest. "American? Did you hit your head? Are you bleeding?" Dylan touched his forehead instinctively and felt a small cut. Nothing serious, but it explained the throbbing pain. The young woman looked up and down the street, then back at him. Dylan could see the exact moment she made a decision that would change both their lives. "Come with me," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Lucia." The Vasquez family house was 3 blocks from the main square, a traditional Galician stone construction with thick walls that had protected generations from Atlantic winters. Lucia ran the last few meters, holding Dylan's hand firmly while he limped beside her, both laughing breathlessly when they finally crossed the solid wooden door and escaped the storm. "Mamá!" Lucia shouted, taking off her soaked shoes. "Tenemos visita!" Carmen Vasquez appeared from the kitchen, drying her hands. On a flowered apron, a woman in her early 40s with the same honey-colored eyes as her daughter, and an expression of instant maternal caution. Her gaze swept Dylan from his dripping hair to his muddy hiking boots, noticing the feverish pallor of his cheeks and the way he favored his left foot. "Lucia, ¿qué has hecho?" she asked in Spanish, but her eyes were already softening at seeing the young man's condition. "He's sick, Mama, and he hurt his foot. All the hostels are full," Lucia explained, quickly, alternating between Spanish and English. "We can't leave him in the street like this." Dylan tried to protest, his elite upbringing emerging automatically. "I don't want to be a bother. I can look for another place. In this rain? With that fever?" Carmen approached and without ceremony placed her hand on his forehead. Her palm was cool and smelled of lavender and homemade soap. "Ay, Dios mío, estás ardiendo en fiebre." A loud noise of claws on wood announced the arrival of Lord Aee, a dog of indefinite breed with golden fur and intelligent eyes that appeared to have at least 10 years of accumulated wisdom. The animal approached Dylan with the quiet confidence of one who judges character better than any personality test, sniffed his hands, and after a moment of silent evaluation, leaned against the stranger's legs with approval. "Lord likes you," said Lucia, smiling. "He's very selective with people." "Dogs usually are good judges," Dylan murmured, petting the furry head. "I mean, dogs are usually good judges of character." Carmen exchanged a look with her daughter, the kind of silent communication that only exists between women who have lived alone long enough to develop their own language. Dylan saw her hesitation, the responsibility of 2 women alone weighing against the Christian compassion that clearly defined who she was. "One night," Carmen decided finally, "until the fever breaks and the foot gets better." Lucia led Dylan to the small guest room on the 2nd floor, a simple but welcoming space with a single bed, a polished wooden dresser, and a window that looked out onto the backyard where Carmen kept a garden of medicinal herbs. The walls were decorated with family photographs. Dylan recognized Lucia at various ages, always with the same radiant smile, but noticed the conspicuous absence of male figures in the more recent photos. "Where's your father?" he asked without thinking, then cursed himself for the lack of tact. "He died 3 years. There you go," Lucia replied simply, without bitterness. "Heart attack. Since then, it's just the 3 of us, Mama, me, and Lord." Her direct honesty was a shock compared to the elaborately evasive conversations of Dylan's world. People of his social class didn't talk about death. They talked about losses and passings, and changed the subject as quickly as possible. "I'm sorry," he said, and was surprised to really mean it. "He would have liked you," Lucia smiled, taking clean towels from the closet. "He always said you can judge a man's character by how dogs react to him. Lord approved of you in 3 seconds, that's almost a record." That first night, Dylan's fever worsened significantly. He alternated between violent chills and waves of heat that left the sheets soaked in sweat. Carmen appeared regularly with herbal teas she grew herself, taking his temperature and administering acetaminophen from the small pharmacy she kept at home for family emergencies. Lucia, who was studying veterinary medicine at the University of Santiago, took on the role of night nurse, checking on him every 2 hours with the same meticulous patience she would use with an injured animal. "Do you have experience with humans?" Dylan asked, one of the times she appeared with more tea and a cold compress for his forehead. "Not much," she admitted, "but anatomy is anatomy, and you're being a very cooperative guinea pig." Even through the fog of fever, Dylan laughed, a genuine sound he hadn't produced in months. It was during the second day that his situation became complicated. Dylan had developed a harsh cough that left Carmen worried, and his ankle swelled so much he could barely put weight on his foot. Lucia insisted on examining him properly, her hands surprisingly firm and confident as she palpated the injury site. "It's not broken," she announced, "but you did a fine job on the ligaments. You need at least a week of rest." "I can't stay a week," Dylan protested, trying to get up and immediately regretting it. "You don't even know me. You can't walk," Carmen interrupted firmly from the doorway, "and you're too sick to travel. ¿Qué clase de cristianas seríamos si te mandáramos embora así?" It was a rhetorical question, but Dylan found himself considering the answer. In his world, what kind of Christians were his people? What kind of person had he become when the genuine kindness of strangers seemed so extraordinary? That afternoon, while Lucia studied at the kitchen table and Carmen worked in her garden, Dylan was alone with Lord in the living room, watching through the window the cobblestone streets where other pilgrims passed, carrying their backpacks toward Santiago. For the first time in 33 days, he didn't envy them. Instead, he felt something that took several minutes to recognize: gratitude. Not the superficial kind of thanks he automatically expressed when someone held a door or served his coffee, but a deep and visceral gratitude for these 2 women, who had taken him in without asking for anything in return, who cared for him with a quiet competence that made his throat tighten. When Lucia returned from the university that afternoon with veterinary anatomy books under her arm, Dylan had made a decision that would change everything. "I want to cook for you," he announced. Lucia blinked. "You know how to cook?" "My grandmother taught me," Dylan said, surprised by the sudden wave of longing. "She was from Galicia too. Immigrants. Made the best stews I ever tasted." It was true, though he had never mentioned this to anyone in his social circle. In Manhattan high society, having immigrant grandparents was something you discreetly omitted, not something you were proud of. "Tu abuela era gallega?" she asked. "From Pontevedra," Dylan replied. "Maria Mitchell. Well, Maria Fernandez before she married." Carmen's face lit up with a smile that completely transformed her features. "No me digas. My cousin lives in Pontevedra. ¿Cómo se llamaba la familia de tu abuela?" For 2 hours, while Dylan limped around the kitchen preparing a Galician stew from memory, he found himself telling stories about his grandmother that he hadn't thought about in years. How she had immigrated at 16 with nothing but a cardboard suitcase and a recipe for octopus a la Guerrero. How she had worked 16 hours a day in a textile factory to help pay for her younger brother's passage. How she had insisted that Dylan learn to cook because a man who can't take care of himself can't take care of anyone. Lucia watched him cut onions with the unconscious precision of someone who had done this 1,000 times, noticing how his hands, aristocratic but calloused by the Camino, moved with a confidence that contrasted with his vulnerability of recent days. "You're not who I thought you were," she said softly. Dylan stopped mid-motion, the knife suspended over a carrot. "What did you think I was?" "I don't know, just different." It was the question Dylan had been avoiding throughout the entire Camino. Who was he when there was no family wealth to define him, when there were no board expectations, strategic marriages, or inherited responsibilities? Here, in this Galician kitchen, seasoning a stew with the salt of unshed tears for his grandmother, who had died 10 years ago, Dylan Mitchell began to discover the answer. On the 4th morning, Dylan finally woke up without fever. His head was clear for the first time in days, and the ankle swelling had decreased enough for him to put on a sock. He went down to the kitchen, expecting to find Carmen preparing breakfast as always, but the house was strangely quiet. "Hola?" he called, limping to the kitchen. A note was stuck to the refrigerator. "Emergencia en la farmacia, volvemos pronto." "Sí." Dylan smiled, getting bread and cheese for a simple breakfast. It was the first time he had been alone in the house, and the trust this represented warmed him more than any blanket. Hitati was cutting slices of bread when he heard footsteps in the backyard. Lucia appeared at the kitchen door carrying a bucket of water for the garden, but stopped abruptly when she saw him standing alone in the kitchen. "How's the foot?" she asked, setting the bucket on the floor. "Much better. I think Dr. Lucia worked better than we expected." She laughed, but there was something different in her expression, a hesitation that wasn't there before. Dylan noticed she avoided his gaze while washing her hands at the sink. "Lucia, did something happen?" She dried her hands too slowly, clearly buying time. "Dylan, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Your last name, Mitchell, is it common in the United States?" Dylan's stomach sank. "Reasonably common. Why?" Lucia turned to face him, and Dylan saw she was holding something, his American passport. "This fell out of your pocket yesterday when Mama was washing your clothes," she said softly. "I didn't want to go through your things, but I needed to make sure you were who you said you were. Because of Mama, you understand? 2 women alone?" "Of course," Dylan said quickly. "I understand perfectly. You did the right thing. So I looked up your name on Google." Dylan closed his eyes. Of course she had looked. Any sensible person would. "What did you find?" Lucia pulled her phone from her pocket and showed the screen. The New York Times headline from 3 months ago: "Mitchell Properties announces $340 million merger as heir. Apparent Dylan Mitchell disappears from public eye." "This is you," she said. It wasn't a question. Dylan looked at the photo accompanying the article, himself in a $3,000 tuxedo, next to Victoria Pemberton, in a dress that cost more than Carmen's car, both smiling the kind of smile you learn in etiquette classes. It looked like a photo of another person, from another life. "Yes," he said simply. Lucia studied his face for a long moment. "Mitchell Properties. They own buildings in Manhattan. Among other things. How much money does your family have, Dylan?" He could have lied, could have minimized, used the euphemisms his social class employed to talk about wealth without sounding vulgar. Instead, he looked into Lucia's honey-colored eyes and told the truth. Net worth of approximately $230 million, maybe more depending on the real estate market. The silence that followed was broken only by the tick-tock of the kitchen clock and the distant sound of Lord barking at some cat in the yard. $230 million, Lucia repeated slowly, studying his face with a new intensity. "So, was all this real? The fever, the desperation, you needing help? Or were you just studying how the poor live?" The question cut Dylan like a blade. Even in his total honesty, the chasm between their worlds created a natural and painful distrust. "Lucia, you could buy our entire town," she continued, her voice colder now. "You could have solved everything with one phone call. Why pretend you needed us?" "I didn't pretend anything," Dylan said, his own voice getting rough. "Every moment of pain, every drop of sweat, every tear I shed was real. Money doesn't make emotional pain less real. You want to know why I'm here? Because 3 months ago I found out my fiancé was sleeping with my best friend. Best friend since we were 8 years old. Fiancé chosen by my father to consolidate strategic partnerships." Lucia remained silent, but Dylan saw her expression soften slightly. "You want to know why I walked 435 miles? Because never in my life have I had to really need something. Never knew what it was like to be truly lost, truly vulnerable. Never knew what it was like for someone to care for me because they wanted to, not because they were paid to." His voice was getting rougher, years of frustration finally finding words. "You want to know why I didn't call home when I was robbed? Because one phone call from me would solve everything. But it would also destroy the only chance I have to find out who I am when I'm not just a last name and a bank account." Lucia approached slowly and sat in the chair beside him. "Dylan, you're 19 years old and know exactly who you are," he continued, looking at his own hands. "You know what you want to study. You know how to care for people. You know how to be genuine. I'm 22 years old and never had a real conversation with another person until I got here. That's not true. It is. Every conversation of my life was calculated. Every friendship, every relationship, every family dinner. Everyone wants something or is selling something or is testing whether I'm worthy of the Mitchell name. Dylan looked up to meet Lucia, watching him with an expression he couldn't decipher. Do you think I want something now? She asked softly. I don't know. I want to believe you don't. And if I tell you I don't want anything of yours, then I'd say you're the first person in 10 years to say that and actually seem like you're telling the truth. Lucia reached out and touched his hand briefly. I'm telling the truth. They remained in silence for several minutes, the weight of revelation settling between them. Finally, Lucia spoke. Can I tell you a secret too? Dylan nodded. Since Papa died, I dream of traveling. I want to see other countries, other cultures. I want to see the world beyond Melide and Santiago. She paused, playing with a splinter in the wooden table. But I can't leave Mama alone. It's just the two of us now, and every time I think about leaving, I feel terrible and selfish. Why is that a secret? Because Mama sacrificed everything for me after Papa died. She works double at the pharmacy, never goes out, never dates. How can I tell her I want to leave? Dylan understood. It was a different kind of prison, but still a prison. Have you ever talked to her about it? How can I? Hi, Mama, I know you need me, but I want to abandon you to travel the world? Or maybe, hi, Mama, I love you and trust that you're strong enough to support me in following my dreams. Lucia looked at him with surprise. When did you get so wise? 3 days of fever gives you time to think. They smiled at each other, and Dylan felt something fundamental change between them. It was no longer the hidden millionaire and the local student. They were just two young people trying to figure out how to navigate between family and freedom, responsibility and authenticity. Dylan? Yes? Thank you for trusting me. Thank you for asking. When Carmen returned an hour later, she found the two of them in the kitchen preparing lunch together, talking in low voices about family and dreams, and the complicated things that happen when you grow up realizing that the people you love are also human. She didn't ask what had changed, but Dylan saw that she noticed. Mothers always notice these things. The next morning, Dylan woke up knowing it was time to leave. His fever had completely broken, his ankle was almost normal, and he had imposed on the Vasquez hospitality long enough. More importantly, he knew that each additional day would make it harder to leave this place that had become more home than any Manhattan penthouse. Lucia found him packing in the kitchen after breakfast, folding his few washed clothes on the table. You're really leaving, she said, not a question. Santiago is only 3 days' walk. I need to finish what I started. Alone. Dylan stopped folding a t-shirt and looked at her. What do you mean? Well, Lucia said, trying to sound casual, I'm on vacation from university for 2 more weeks, and I've never seen Santiago de Compostela properly. I mean, I've lived my whole life 37 miles away, but I've never done the pilgrimage. Dylan's heart accelerated, but he forced himself to keep his voice balanced. You want to come with me? If you don't mind an amateur tour guide. And your mother? I already talked to her. As if summoned, Carmen appeared at the kitchen door, drying her hands on her apron. El camino es seguro, she said in careful English. Lucia knows the history. It will be good for her. Dylan looked between mother and daughter, seeing an entire conversation that had happened in his absence. Are you sure? He asked Carmen. Lord approved of you, she smiled. That's a good recommendation. 2 hours later, Dylan and Lucia were in Melody's main square, both carrying backpacks. His patched but functional, hers clearly borrowed from some cousin or friend. Carmen had insisted on preparing provisions enough for a week, and Dylan suspected that half the weight of Lucia's backpack was composed of medicines and bandages, just in case. Ready? Lucia asked, adjusting the backpack straps. More than ready. They walked side by side through the cobblestone streets Dylan had only known wet, sick, and desperate 5 days before. Now, under the weak autumn Galician sun, Melody seemed like a completely different place. Not an emergency refuge, but the place where his journey had really begun. The next 3 days passed like a waking dream. Lucia proved to be an excellent guide, telling stories of medieval saints and ancient legends as they walked through eucalyptus forests and fields where cows looked at them with bovine curiosity. Dylan discovered that walking with company was completely different from walking alone, where before there had been only the hypnotic rhythm of steps and circular thoughts. Now there were conversations that meandered through topics ranging from cheap philosophy to childhood memories. "Tell me about your grandmother," Lucia asked on the second afternoon as they rested beside a medieval fountain. Maria was... Dylan stopped, searching for the right words. "She was the strongest person I ever met, came to America without speaking English, worked until her hands bled to bring the rest of the family. When my grandfather died young, she raised 5 children alone, like my mother with 1 child." Exactly, but Maria always said that strength doesn't mean hardness. She cooked for neighbors when they were sick, even when she barely had food for us, said that generosity is what separates humans from animals. "She sounds like Carmen. That's why I feel so at home with you," Dylan admitted. "Carmen reminds me of her in a way I hadn't felt in years." On the third morning, they woke early to reach Santiago before noon. The cathedral appeared first as a distant promise through the mist, then gradually materialized into stone towers that seemed to touch the low clouds. "It's more impressive than I imagined," Dylan murmured when they finally entered the Plaza do Obradoiro. "You waited 435 miles to see this," Lucia smiled. "Was it worth it?" Dylan looked around the square, where hundreds of pilgrims of all ages and nationalities were celebrating their arrivals, some crying with relief, others singing, many simply sitting in silence, absorbing the moment. "It was worth every blister, every day of rain, every night sleeping on the ground," he said, but he was looking at her when he said it. They obtained their Compostelas the following afternoon, the official certificates that prove completion of the Camino. Dylan held the parchment with his name in elegant Latin, feeling a pride he had never experienced with any of his previous diplomas or awards. "And now?" Lucia asked as they left the pilgrim's office. "Now?" Dylan hesitated. The truth was he hadn't planned anything beyond reaching Santiago. "Honestly, I don't know." "Well, there's a tradition," Lucia said with a mischievous smile. "Pilgrims who reach Santiago traditionally continue to Finisterre, the end of the world. It's another 56 miles, but the end of the world. Cape Finisterre. The Romans thought it was literally where the world ended. There's a lighthouse on a cliff over the Atlantic. Traditional pilgrims burned something that represented their old life and watched the sunset over the ocean. The idea resonated with Dylan in a way he couldn't explain. "Do you want to go?" "If you want to." They took the bus to Finisterre the next morning, a spontaneous decision that surprised them both. Dylan, accustomed to walking for more than a month, discovered that sitting for 2 hours in a moving vehicle was more nauseating than any day of walking. Lucia laughed when he had to stop to vomit, offering to be his guinea pig once more. "Months of walking and you get carsick on a bus," she teased gently, rubbing his back as he recovered beside the road. "Life's irony," he groaned. Finisterre was exactly as Lucia had described, a small fishing port dominated by a solitary lighthouse on a rocky promontory that extended into the Atlantic like a finger pointing to infinity. They found lodging in a hostel full of pilgrims who, like them, had decided to push a little beyond the official destination. That night they climbed to the lighthouse to watch the sunset. The ocean stretched endlessly before them, waves crashing against rocks 100 meters below, with a hypnotic rhythm that made time seem insignificant. Other pilgrims were scattered among the rocks, some alone in silent contemplation, others in small groups sharing bottles of wine and stories of their journeys. "What are you going to burn?" Lucia asked, watching a German couple feed a small fire with what appeared to be letters. Dylan reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded photo he had carried throughout the entire Camino, a professional engagement photo of him and Victoria, both looking perfect and empty in a manicured garden in Southampton. "This," he said, showing the photo to Lucia. "She's beautiful," Lucia said softly. "She is. And intelligent, and well-educated, and perfectly suitable to be the wife of a Mitchell heir," Dylan said, looking at the photo. "And also absolutely wrong. For me. How did you know?" Dylan thought about the question, watching the waves break against the rocks. "Because in 2 years of dating, she never asked me how I felt about anything. Never wanted to know what my dreams were, my fears, my hopes. She knew my social calendar, my bank account, my family lineage, but she never knew me." He looked at Lucia, who was sitting beside him on a smooth stone. her hair swaying in the salty breeze. "You knew me in 5 days better than she did in 2 years. Maybe because I met you when you needed help, not when you were useful for something." The simplicity of her observation hit him like a punch to the stomach. Victoria had met him at charity parties, corporate events, dinners where his last name opened doors and his wealth sealed deals. Lucia had met him sick, lost, vulnerable, and penniless. "Can I tell you a secret?" Dylan said. "Always. These have been the best days of my life." Lucia turned to look at him completely. "Even sick and with a sprained foot?" "Especially sick and with a sprained foot, because for the first time someone cared for me because they wanted to, not because they were paid to or because they were going to gain something from it." The golden light of the sunset was painting Lucia's face, transforming her honey-colored eyes into something that looked like liquid gold. Dylan felt his heart accelerate, but this time it wasn't from fever. "Lucia." "Yes." "Can I kiss you?" In response, she leaned closer, closing the distance between them. The kiss was soft at first, hesitant, then deeper when she responded. Dylan felt years of tension and loneliness dissolve like salt in the ocean. When they separated, they sat in silence for a long moment, watching the last streaks of light fade on the horizon. "What's going to happen now?" Lucia asked softly. "I don't know," Dylan admitted. "For the first time in my life, I really don't know." "Does that scare you?" "Less than it should." They burned the engagement photo that night, watching it curl and darken until it became ashes that the Atlantic wind carried to the sea. Dylan felt strangely light, as if he had burned more than a photo. He had burned 2 decades of expectations that were never his. The next morning, they made the walk back to the bus that would take them back to Santiago, and from there to Melide. Dylan carried an official Finisterre certificate, the Fisterana, along with his Compostela, but the papers seemed less important than the quiet certainty that had settled in his chest. During the trip back, Lucia fell asleep against his shoulder, and Dylan spent the 2 hours watching the Galician landscape pass by the fogged window, thinking about possible futures for the first time without anxiety. When they arrived in Melide, Carmen was waiting for them at the bus station with Lord beside her, the dog's tail wagging with approval when he saw Dylan get off the vehicle. "Como fue?" Carmen asked, hugging both of them. "Perfecto," Lucia replied, but she was looking at Dylan when she said it. That night, during dinner in the family kitchen that had become so familiar, Dylan made a decision that had been forming since he burned the photo in Finisterre. "I'm going to spend a year traveling," he announced suddenly. Lucia almost choked on her wine. "What do you mean?" "I want to see the world the right way. Not 5-star hotels and guided tours, but the real way. Backpack on my back, meeting local people, learning. Languages. And your parents, the company. I'll explain to them when I return to New York next week. I'll tell them I need a year to grow before taking on responsibilities that will last the rest of my life." Carmen nodded with approval. "Es muy sensato. Very wise." "And you?" Dylan asked Lucia. "Do you still want to travel?" Her face lit up, then darkened. "I can't leave, Mama." "Lucia," Carmen interrupted gently. "Querida, I'm not a helpless old woman. I'm 43 years old, not 83. But no buts. You think I don't see how your eyes shine when you talk about other countries? You think your father would have wanted you to sacrifice your dreams for me?" Lucia looked between her mother and Dylan, tears forming in the corners of her eyes. "It wouldn't be forever," Dylan said gently. "Maybe a few months. See Europe properly, maybe part of Asia. Come back to start your veterinary residency. And you'd teach me English properly? If you'd teach me Spanish properly." Carmen clapped once, a decisive sound that cut through the tension. "It's decided. Lucia will travel, Dylan will learn Spanish, and I'll finally have time to date that handsome widower from the pharmacy in Santiago." "Mama!" Lucia screamed, but she was laughing. 2 days later, Dylan was at Santiago airport, carrying only a small backpack and a Finisterre certificate that was worth more to him than any Harvard diploma. Lucia had come to say goodbye, and the tension of imminent separation weighed between them like Atlantic fog. "So," Dylan said, holding her hands, "a few weeks in New York to sort things out with my family, then London. We said 3 months through Europe?" 3 months, Lucia confirmed. "And then we decide." And then we decide. They kissed one last time, a kiss that carried promises but not pressure, hope but not expectations. "Dylan," Lucia said as he was walking away. "Yes, thank you for letting me take care of you. Thank you for teaching me that I deserved care." 6 months later, Dylan Mitchell appeared in all the major financial publications when he announced he was taking a 2-year leave from Mitchell Properties to seek personal growth and global perspective before assuming leadership responsibilities. Wall Street was confused, his family was worried. Victoria Pemberton married his ex-best friend 3 months later. Dylan was in a cafe in Bangkok when he read about the wedding, sitting next to Lucia, who was practicing her Thai pronunciation with a local fruit vendor. They had spent 2 months in Europe, 1 month in India, and were planning 6 weeks in Southeast Asia before Lucia returned to start her residency. "She looks happy," Lucia said, looking at the wedding photo on Dylan's phone. "She looks perfect," Dylan corrected, "which is different from happy." "And you? Are you happy?" Dylan looked around the chaotic Bangkok cafe, where they were drinking coffee that cost the equivalent of 50 American cents, and planning to take an overnight train to Chiang Mai. His parents had stopped calling weekly. His former friends had stopped inviting him to events. His bank account was experiencing for the first time the novelty of having real limits. "I'm happier than I ever imagined it was possible to be," he said, and it was the most honest truth he had ever spoken. When they returned to Malidi 6 weeks later, Carmen met them at the bus station with Lord and a smile that could have lit up all of Galicia. Dylan hugged the 2 women who had saved his life in ways he was still discovering, inhaled the familiar scent of lavender and homemade soap, and knew he had finally found something that no family fortune could buy, the place where he belonged, not by birth or inheritance, but by choice. In the backyard that night, while Carmen and Lucia prepared a welcome dinner, Dylan sat with Lord at his feet and wrote an email to his parents. It was time to go home, not to be who they expected him to be, but to be who he had discovered he was. The world was too big to be inherited, but small enough to be loved, one caring person at a time. And sometimes, if you were lucky enough, one of those people would care for you when you were lost, sick, and far from home, and you would discover that being lost was exactly where you needed to be to find yourself. Dylan and Lucia's story reminds us that true wealth isn't in bank accounts, but in the human connections we build when we are most vulnerable. That sometimes losing everything is necessary to find what really matters, and that the sincere care of a stranger can transform not just a rainy night, but an entire life. And you? Have you ever experienced the kindness of strangers when you needed it most? Have you ever discovered that being lost can be the first step to finding yourself? If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel for more narratives that celebrate the transformative power of human compassion. In the comments, share which moment of Dylan's journey resonated most with you. Was it the vulnerability in the rain, Lucia's care, or perhaps his courage to live authentically? Remember, this is a fictional story created for entertainment and inspiration, but the lessons about love, loss, and new beginnings are as real as the Camino de Santiago that still today welcomes pilgrims in search of themselves.